There is a terrifying phenomenon that occurs in the deepest and largest mines on Earth. And in 1958, this would occur in the deepest mine in North America, and the results would be catastrophic for the miners over 10,000 feet underground. This is that horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Nova Scotia is one of Canada's 13 provinces and territories with a population of just more than 1 million in early 2024. Incredibly, among the country's provinces and territories, it's the second most densely populated as well as the second smallest by area. It's also home to a variety of natural resources, and so mining has been a central part of its economy for more than 300 years. Over that time, the province has exported more than 20 different mineral products all over the world, but beginning in the 18th century all the way through the better part of the 20th century, coal was king in Nova Scotia. It's estimated that around 400 million tons of it have been mined from more than 300 coal deposits since 1720. One of the most abundant of these mines in Nova Scotia's history is located in Spring Hill, which was a city of around 7,000 in the 1950s. Digging at these Spring Hill mines began in the 19th century and eventually became one of the deepest coal mines in North America, and also one of the deepest in the world with a depth of 4,260 feet or 1,300 meters. And during its heyday, the Spring Hill mine saw its share of success and a couple of horrific disasters. The first one was on February 21st, 1891, when an explosion occurred in the number 1 and number 2 collieries, which was caused by an accumulation of coal dust that was blown through both shafts by the ventilation system. The dust then ignited and caused one of the worst disasters in Nova Scotia's history, with 125 miners losing their lives. Then, 65 years later, another 39 miners were killed in November of 1956 when another blast occurred with circumstances oddly similar to the first explosion. A large quantity of fine coal dust was being carried toward the exit of the mine by a rail car, and on its journey, it passed through a strong gust from the ventilation system. This highly flammable dust then spread, which was then compounded when the train derailed and collided with a power line. And when it did, the electricity arced and lit the coal dust. Much like the first, this explosion and derailment was catastrophic for the community and the mine. Most of the number 4 shaft was destroyed, which trapped a handful of miners underground for some time until they were rescued. Then, once the survivors were out, the tunnels to the still raging fire were closed off with bricks to choke off its oxygen supply so it would burn itself out. By January of the following year, the bricks could finally be removed and the rest of the bodies recovered. However, the number 4 shaft would be closed permanently as a result. Incredibly, this could have been much worse if not for changes that had been implemented after the 1891 disaster, and new mining technology was credited with allowing 88 miners to escape with their lives. Part of the credit for that goes to a mining technique change that occurred about 20 years earlier. Mining coal can be done in a number of ways using a variety of processes, and from when the Spring Hill mine opened in the 1930s, the coal deposit there was mined using something known as the room and pillar technique. This is when long horizontal corridors are lined with timber supports that lead to different rooms where mining occurs. This is also done in a sort of grid pattern to help maintain the structural integrity of the mine. One of the disadvantages of this method, though, is that by leaving natural rock pillars to support the weight of the layer above, overall coal production couldn't reach its full potential because parts of the deposit quite literally supported the mine. Additionally, if the pillars in the tunnels weren't installed correctly, it could cause collapses. So eventually, Spring Hill switched to something known as longwall mining. This is when miners go back and forth across the whole face of a deposit to remove everything as they move forward. As the coal is extracted, hydraulic supports temporarily hold up the roof, and as the miners continue on, the roof of the mine sections behind them is allowed to collapse in a controlled way. Surprisingly, although this sounds more dangerous, this is actually considered safer than room and pillar mining. In addition, the longwall technique would yield around 80% recovery rate compared to the 60% using room and pillar. However, even with a safer technique and even with the best preparation, sometimes things happen that are entirely out of your control. It was mid-afternoon on October 23, 1958, when 45-year-old Maurice Ruddick, Levi Miley, and 172 other second-shift Spring Hill miners showed up for work. As the crew went to their various work areas, Maurice's mind was elsewhere. Earlier that day, he brought his wife and their brand new baby home from the hospital, which was the couple's 12th child. With so many mouths to feed, Maurice couldn't afford to take much time off, so even though he would much rather be at home helping his wife, he had to keep mining to provide for his family. While he daydreamed, the men stepped onto trolleys that took them to some of the deepest, darkest reaches of the mine. As was commonly the case on the long trip inside, the crew talked, joked, and even sang. Maurice was once in a quartet and loved the opportunity to sing with the other men he shared the mine with. Now, just as an aside, although the depth of the mine was 4,200 feet, the shafts were dug diagonally, and so many of the levels were assigned names based on their length instead of their depth. That's why the levels will have names that seem far longer than the total depth of the mine. Anyway, around the 13,000 foot level, or nearly 4,000 meters into the mine, Maurice and Levi hopped off the trolley and began making their way to the gigantic wall they'd be chipping away at. When they reached their work site, Maurice found himself starving, so he opened his lunchbox, grabbed a sandwich, and scarfed it down while preparing to move some coal with Levi. For the next 6 hours, the pair worked tirelessly, blasting coal off the wall using compressed air chipper picks and loading onto the conveyor, which took it all the way to the mine carts that would carry it to the surface. They would do this all the way until their shift ended at 11 o'clock when the night crew would come to relieve them. As they worked, Maurice's thoughts returned to his family. By the time he'd get home, the kids and his wife would be fast asleep, but that didn't mean he couldn't spend some time marveling at the family's new addition, and he was looking forward to that. Several hours later, at exactly 8:05 p.m., he was slammed back to his senses as the ground started to shake. This was a feeling miners and Spring Hill residents were all too familiar with. The mines were so massive and so deep that the rock inside was constantly under more and more pressure. As coal was removed, so was the natural support the rock provided, which is why hydraulic supports and pillars were necessary to make up for that difference. Still, the amount of weight on the layer above was constantly growing, and even in the days leading up to that moment, the men noticed that the normally soft coal was hardening, making it much more difficult to remove. They knew that this meant something known as a bump was coming. This is a phenomenon that's generally only a problem for the largest of mines. A bump is literal seismic activity that's caused by the mine itself. Since weight is constantly shifting with the removal of rock and ore, stress starts to build and eventually the mine starts to shift. This can eventually cause a sudden, violent failure of the supports and earthquakes of varying strength. In fact, between March and September of that year, 6 large bumps had been recorded, and even earlier that same day, a smaller bump was felt but mostly ignored. In that instant though, Maurice and Levi knew that this wasn't just an average bump when the walls, floor, and ceilings started to collapse, shooting massive rocks in every direction. There were then 3 shockwaves that tore through the mine, closing exits with piles of heavy rock debris. Maurice had been standing near the top of the wall when it hit, and the sound was so deafening that it made him dizzy. Then, as quickly as it started, the bump came to an end as the noise from the shaking was replaced by the screams of men at nearly every level of the mine. As Maurice started to regain his wits, he found that he was buried up to his waist in coal. Then, turning his headlamp on, he could see nothing but coal dust all around him, knowing that if it ignited, he would burn to death. It wasn't until it all settled that he saw that the once tall tunnel was now only about 5 feet or 1.5 meters high. Maurice then began to check himself over because the situation was so disorienting that he wasn't even sure if he was hurt badly or not initially. Miraculously, other than a few small cuts and bruises, he was fine, and overall, considering the destruction around him, he was extremely lucky when many of his colleagues were not. After crawling out of the coal, Maurice came across another miner, a man named Percy Rector, whose arm had been squished between 2 large timber supports. Unfortunately, all the tools and equipment they had before the bump were now buried under the rubble, and there was no way to free him otherwise. So next, Maurice gathered up every aspirin the 7 men around him had on them and fed them to Percy. Then, once Percy's pain was addressed, Maurice looked around to size up their situation. The 7 men were now locked into an area around 50 feet or 15 meters long, 4 feet or just over a meter wide, and just high enough to stand up in. All of the exits were completely closed off otherwise. So, with nothing to do but wait, the miners lay down on the ground, uncertain of when or if they could be rescued. Almost as soon as the bump dissipated, Spring Hill citizens started arriving at the mine. Everyone who lived there at least knew someone who worked in the mines, but the vast majority of the town was made up of mining families. Many of them would even joke that if the Spring Hill mines weren't there, the city of 7,000 at the time would have a population of just 500 people. As mine officials started to assess the situation, they discovered that the phones to levels below 7,800 feet were completely knocked out. George Calder, the manager of the number 2 shaft, then immediately ordered the train cars off the tracks and for trolleys to begin bringing men out of the mine. The rescue effort was going to need a lot of men on foot too, but when the ground erupted less than an hour earlier, dangerous levels of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide were released and flooded the mine. However, this didn't matter to George and many of the uninjured miners who were ready to get in there and rescue their fellow crewmen. With 20 volunteers, George told the rescue coordinator to summon the Draggermen before the group he was leading began down the slope of the number 2 shaft. The Draggermen were named for the company that manufactured their breathing equipment, and they were a specialized group of mine rescuers who were often responsible for clearing noxious gas from the tunnels. They carried 2 hours worth of air each, which gave them much more time in dangerous rescue situations. That first crew of rescuers led by George didn't have to go very far before the destruction inside the mine was clear though. Floors and ceilings at multiple levels had collapsed, creating obstructions for rescuers trying to get to the further reaches. In fact, most of the shift that night was working on levels at 13,000 feet and 13,800 feet. When George and his group reached the area where the majority of miners were supposed to be, they were greeted with a horrible sight. The levels were completely jammed up with debris, and getting beyond the rock falls was going to be a challenge, especially with gases at 13,000 feet starting to affect the rescuers. It took the better part of the next 3 hours for them to create enough of an opening to burrow through, and when they made it, they found 13 miners trapped on the other side. By that time, only 36 of 174 miners had made it out of the crumbling labyrinth below ground, and rescuers could hear the cries and groans of men in other sections they couldn't reach yet. As the sun rose over Spring Hill the next morning, the count of survivors who made it out reached 81. Among them, 15 were injured enough to need medical attention, and many of those who had escaped were working on the 13,400 foot levels and the 13,800 foot levels, but a further 93 men were unaccounted for on the 13,000 foot level. As the picture of the disaster became more and more clear, another terrifying discovery was made. Those who weren't working inside galleries or who hadn't been able to take appropriate shelter had been completely crushed between the floors, ceilings, and walls that gave way during the bump. And rescuers began to find pieces everywhere as they continued. The number of those still lost was uncertain, but it was clear that the toll would be considerable. And at around 5:45 on the morning of October 24th, the body of the first dead miner was removed from the mine and taken to the morgue. Outside the mine, the crowd had grown to include nearly all of Spring Hill, and they were joined by reporters from media outlets all over. Also arriving at Spring Hill that morning was Harold Gordon, the coal chief of Dosco, which owned the company that ran the mine. In the 1956 disaster 2 years earlier, it was actually Harold who led the rescue effort. As soon as he learned of this new incident, he jumped into his car and drove 300 miles to the scene and arrived in the early hours of October 24th. Then once he was there, he wasted very little time and entered the mine with another group of rescuers to assess the situation. 9 hours later, he returned with grim news. He believed all 93 of the remaining missing men were dead, and he told reporters as much through a cracking voice. Harold was wrong though. The 7 men that included Maurice were still alive and waiting for rescue. They could hear what was going on around them, but it seemed like the noise never got much closer. Then in another area where Levi was working when the bump hit, he was putting wooden supports into the roof near the top of the 13,000 foot level. The force of the jolts threw him off his scaffold and onto the rock floor below, but somehow he scrambled into a small rock cove not much bigger than the one Maurice was trapped in, and just like Maurice, Levi wasn't alone. With him were 11 more miners, but one of which was badly hurt. The man's leg was trapped under debris, almost certainly broken, and any movement of the rocks around him caused him agonizing pain. There was unfortunately nothing anyone could do for him though. He'd have to remain there until rescue arrived, whenever that would occur. For days afterward, only bodies were recovered by the dejected rescuers coming out of the mine. And for those who were still alive and trapped below, the longer they were held captive, the more starvation and dehydration became a concern. Both Maurice and Levi's respective groups pooled all their food and water together and rationed them out. The supplies wouldn't last forever, but at least what they had would buy the rescuers more time to reach them. Maurice's group even divvied up some chewing tobacco one of the men had. And while none of the trapped miners had much, they had hope that was kept alive by the constant sound of rescuers feverishly working to reach them. Each of the mine's levels also had a series of pipes running through, which Maurice's group pounded on in an effort to let the others know they were still alive, but even after days of this, they never received a response. A few of the survivors even tried to burrow out, but only made it about 60 feet or 18 meters before they could go no further. Throughout it all, Maurice and his fellow survivors did what they could to keep spirits high. Monday, October 27th, was the 29th birthday of one of the men trapped with Maurice, so they took a sandwich and divided it up among each of them before singing happy birthday. But then, tragically, the next day, Percy succumbed to his devastating arm injury. For days before he passed, he begged the others to remove the arm, but no one had a knife. By that point as well, they were living in complete darkness. All the headlamps had died, and not long after, they ran out of food and water. In an attempt to stave off hunger, some of them even tried eating the dried bark off some of the timber, but this proved to be inedible when it quickly came back up. And 6 days after the bump, the high hopes of rescue had dwindled both inside and outside the mine. That was until it came rushing back on October 29th. That day, a mining engineer was at the 13,000 foot level, testing the levels of harmful gases when he thought he heard the faint sound of talking. There seemed to be no way that anyone could still be alive after all that time, but he stopped to listen anyway. Then, holding his breath, he didn't move a muscle to see if he could hear it again. As the engineer put his ear to the pipe, he could hear someone say they were alive and that water was desperately needed. On the other end, as Levi and the others remained quiet, the response they were waiting for finally came. While rescuers concentrated on removing 60 feet of rock that stood between them and the trapped miners, they were able to use the pipe to send supplies through to them. This immediately lifted the spirits of the men inside. They may still have been trapped and sitting in complete darkness, but their ordeal was coming to an end, and they would enjoy their last few hours in the mine with hot soup, coffee, and cold water. Finally, after nearly 12 hours of continuous work, the last bit of rock was removed from a tunnel rescuers had created, and the men on both sides finally met in celebration and relief. News of the rescue then spread around the community quickly, and the crowd started to gather again to greet the newly found survivors when they finally exited the mine. The discovery and rescue was bittersweet though. There were still 49 men unaccounted for, and the digging continued. In the early morning hours of November 1st, so 9 days after the bump all but destroyed the mine, one of the rescuers heard rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere. He then hushed the other men so he could listen to where it was coming from, and once again it was through a pipe that communication between the two sides was established. Every day of the ordeal, the men in Maurice's group hammered on the pipe, hoping that someone would hear them, but receiving no response, just like Levi's group experienced. But then suddenly, the men inside heard a voice through the pipe asking how many were still alive. The response from the trapped men was a mixture of tears and celebration, and hours later, they were finally free. On their journey back to the surface, most of these 7 rescue men were able to walk at least part of the way under their own power, but all of them were still weak and severely dehydrated despite the water sent through to them through the pipe. When they reached the surface around 9 o'clock that morning, they were greeted with cheers from the gathered crowd before being brought to the hospital. All things considered, they were in surprisingly good shape, although each of them had lost about 10 pounds or more. The 6 men who were trapped with Maurice also credited him with keeping spirits high and preventing the group from giving up hope. When things looked bleak, Maurice would lead the men in prayer or sing a hymn to take their minds off their predicament, even for a moment. And they didn't know it at the time, but they were the last men to walk out of the mine alive. When that was confirmed, it was learned that 75 men lost their lives either during the bump or in the days afterward, and the process of getting the bodies out was painstaking and long. Due to the advanced state of decomposition from heat that far underground, each of the bodies was brought back to the surface inside airtight aluminum coffins. During the ordeal as well, reporters spoke with a handful of miners, many of whom had been stuck inside for at least several days, and their responses to questions about their experiences were vastly different. Levi's first words after 6 days inside the mine was that he needs to get home to tend to his chickens. Another survivor was asked what he wanted most now that he was out of the mine, and he replied that he wanted a 7-Up soda. Upon hearing this interview, the Pepsi-Cola company hired him as a spokesman. Another miner who spoke to the media, however, said that this was his last shift he was ever going to work in a mine, adding that being trapped was the worst experience of his life. Maurice, on the other hand, was unassuming about it all and tried his best to return to life as usual with his 12 children, but the story of his courage throughout the ordeal didn't remain secret for long, and he was eventually recognized as Canada's Citizen of the Year. The Spring Hill mines would continue to operate for another 13 years before closing for good, and an inquiry following the 1958 disaster cleared the parent company of the mine of any wrongdoing. If you made it this far, thanks for tuning in. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.